June 23, 1945. Southern Okinawa. The medical tent smells of iodine and canvas. Outside, artillery rumbles in the distance like a departing storm. Inside, 23-year-old Miyako Nakamura kneels on the dirt floor, hands bound loosely behind her back. Her nursing uniform is torn at the shoulder. Blood, not hers, stains the white fabric brown. She expects a bullet. Maybe a blade. That's what she was told would happen if the Americans took her alive. They will defile you. They will torture you. Death is mercy compared to capture. An American soldier enters. He's young, maybe 20. He carries a canteen and a medical kit. He kneels beside her, and she flinches. He notices. He speaks, soft words she doesn't understand. Then he does something she will remember for the rest of her life. He unties her hands. He offers her water. He examines her wrist where shrapnel grazed the skin, and he cleans it with the same care he would show his own sister. Miyako Nakamura begins to cry. Not from pain. From confusion that in Imperial Japan, the role of women was defined by a single phrase, Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. From childhood, Japanese girls were taught that their purpose was to serve the family, bear children for the empire, and support men who would fight for the emperor. The military structure reflected this hierarchy with absolute rigidity. Women could not serve in combat. They could not hold rank equal to men. They existed in auxiliary roles, nurses, factory workers, communication operators, always subordinate, always secondary. By 1941, as Japan's war machine expanded across the Pacific, millions of women were mobilized into the war effort. They assembled ammunition in Osaka. They operated radio equipment in Rabaul. They served as civilian nurses on battlefields from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. The government called them Jugen Kangofu, military nurses, but gave them no formal military status. They wore uniforms but held no protection under the laws of war. If captured, they existed in a legal gray zone, neither soldier nor civilian, vulnerable to whatever fate awaited them. Imperial propaganda reinforced a singular narrative: the enemy was barbaric. American and Allied soldiers were portrayed as demons who raped, tortured, and mutilated. Newsreels showed fabricated atrocities. Schoolchildren were taught that surrender was worse than death. For women, this messaging was even more explicit. Capture meant dishonor so profound that suicide was the only honorable choice. Thousands of civilians on Saipan threw themselves from cliffs rather than face American troops. Mothers drowned their children in the sea. Young women detonated grenades in caves. This was the reality Miyako Nakamura knew. This was the truth burned into her mind by every teacher, every officer, every propaganda poster she had ever seen. The Americans were monsters. Capture was fate worse than annihilation. And yet, in that tent on Okinawa, she was handed water. The United States military operated under a fundamentally different doctrine. In 1929, the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war established international standards for POW treatment. America signed it. Japan signed it but never ratified it. Still, American forces were bound by their own regulations. Army Field Manual FM 27-10 dictated that all captured personnel, regardless of nationality or gender, were to be treated humanely, fed adequately, given medical care, protected from violence and humiliation. This wasn't idealism. It was strategic policy rooted in both legal obligation and practical intelligence value. Well-treated prisoners provided better information. They were more likely to cooperate, less likely to attempt escape or self-harm. The United States also understood the propaganda value of demonstrating moral superiority. Every Japanese prisoner returned home alive was a living contradiction to Tokyo's narrative. But in the Pacific Theater, prisoner exchanges were rare. The war was brutal, intimate, and often fought to the death. Japanese soldiers followed the Senjinkan military code, a field manual that explicitly forbade surrender. Capture was disgrace. Most Japanese troops chose death over captivity, leading to horrific casualty rates and very few POWs in American hands. By mid-1944, fewer than 5,000 Japanese prisoners had been taken across the entire Pacific, a microscopic number compared to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs held in Europe. Female Japanese prisoners were even rarer. Most women in combat zones were civilians or auxiliary personnel who evacuated before American forces arrived. Those who remained often chose suicide. The few who survived to see American soldiers expected violence. They had been conditioned to fear it. They had been promised it. What they received instead shattered everything they thought they knew. American medics treated their wounds. Military police ensured their safety. Interrogators offered cigarettes and asked questions without physical coercion. Women who had been taught that Americans were subhuman predators discovered men who treated them with something they had never experienced in Imperial Japan's rigid hierarchy. They were treated like equals. Angle 1, Cultural Collision, the Propaganda versus Reality. The Japanese women captured in the Pacific carried more than physical wounds. They carried years of psychological conditioning. From 1937 onward, imperial propaganda had painted a vivid picture of American savagery. Newspapers published illustrations of Allied soldiers with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts described mass rapes in occupied territories. Teachers told students that American troops wore necklaces made from Japanese teeth and ears. For women, the messaging was even darker. Surrender meant certain sexual violence followed by execution. This wasn't hyperbole, it was presented as documented fact. The government distributed cyanide capsules to female workers in frontline areas. Families rehearsed suicide protocols. When Saipan fell in July 1944, thousands of Japanese civilians leaped from cliffs at Marpi Point rather than face capture. Mothers killed their children first. Young women tied themselves together and jumped holding hands. So when the first female POWs found themselves in American custody, their terror was absolute. They waited for the violence to begin. Some refused food, believing it was poisoned. Others attempted suicide with whatever they could find, broken glass, stripped fabric for hanging. A captured nurse on Tinian tried to strangle herself with her own hair. Instead, they were given medical examinations. Female nurses attended to them when available. They received the same rations as American personnel: canned meat, crackers, chocolate, coffee. Items most had never tasted. They were housed separately from male prisoners. Guards were instructed to maintain respectful distance. Interrogations were conducted through translators with minimal pressure. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These women had been told their entire lives that the enemy was inhuman. Now they sat across from young American soldiers who showed them photographs of their own mothers and sisters back home, who asked about their families, who treated infected wounds with sulfa powder and penicillin, medicines Japan's own military could no longer supply to its troops. Angle 2, Medical Care Reality, the Equalizer. Medicine became the first bridge across the cultural chasm. In Imperial Japan's military structure, medical resources followed a strict hierarchy. Officers received priority treatment. Enlisted men came second. Women, whether nurses or civilian auxiliaries, were last. Severe injuries often went untreated. Infections spread unchecked. Pain was endured in silence because complaining was seen as weakness. American field hospitals operated differently. Triage was based on medical need, not rank or gender. A captured Japanese nurse with shrapnel wounds received the same surgical attention as a wounded Marine. Anesthesia was administered equally. Recovery rations were identical. This wasn't charity, it was protocol. For many female POWs, this was their first experience of medical equality. Haruko Yamada, a communications operator captured on Polilliu, later testified that an American doctor spent 40 minutes removing embedded coral fragments from her leg. He used morphine for the pain. He changed her bandages daily. He checked for infection with the same diligence he showed American wounded. She had watched Japanese military doctors walk past injured women to treat men with minor cuts. The psychological impact was profound. These women began to question everything they had been taught. If the propaganda lied about American brutality, what else was false? If the enemy treated them better than their own officers did, what did that say about the empire they had served? Angle 3, Letters Home, the Evidence. The most powerful testimony came from the prisoners themselves. American intelligence officers encouraged captured Japanese to write letters home, both as a humanitarian gesture and as a psychological warfare tool. These letters, when they reached Japan through neutral channels or after the war, carried a message Tokyo could not suppress. One letter, written by a nurse named Sachiko Ishii in late 1945, described her treatment in detail. They give us 3 meals every day. The food is strange but plentiful. The doctors treat us with respect. I have not been harmed. I was told we would be tortured. I was told we would be dishonored. None of it was true. Another, from a civilian woman captured on Okinawa, the American soldiers do not touch us. They speak kindly. They ask if we need anything. I do not understand why we were taught to fear them. These weren't isolated accounts. Dozens of similar testimonies emerged. Some women wrote about female American nurses who brought them soap and clean clothing. Others described interrogators who halted questioning when the prisoners became distressed. Several mentioned being given privacy for bathing, something unthinkable in the mixed-gender chaos of Japan's retreating military camps. Saipan, July 1944. The moment everything changed. The invasion of Saipan brought the war to Japan's doorstep. 15,000 Japanese civilians lived on the island alongside 30,000 troops. As American Marines pushed inland, Japanese commanders ordered civilians to retreat north toward the cliffs. The message was clear: death before dishonor. Surrender was betrayal. On July 9, as the island's defense collapsed, hundreds of civilians gathered at Marpi Point. The cliffs dropped 800 feet into the ocean. Families stood at the edge. Fathers threw children first, then their wives, then themselves. Soldiers detonated grenades in groups. The water below turned red. But not everyone jumped. Among the survivors was Hatsuko Mori, a 28-year-old schoolteacher who had been conscripted to work in a field hospital. She watched the mass suicide from a cave entrance. She heard the screams. She saw the bodies hitting the rocks. And when American soldiers appeared at the cave mouth, she made a choice that defied everything she had been taught. She raised her hands. She walked out. The Marines who took her into custody were young men from farms in Iowa and factories in Pennsylvania. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for fanatics. What they found was a terrified woman who spoke no English and trembled uncontrollably. One Marine, Private First Class James Donovan, later wrote in his diary, "She looked at us like we were going to kill her right there. We gave her water. She couldn't believe it. She just kept saying something in Japanese over and over. Our interpreter said she was apologizing for being alive." Hatsuko was transferred to a civilian internment camp near Charinkanoa. The camp held over 12,000 Japanese civilians by August. They were housed in tents. They received twice-daily meals, rice when available, otherwise canned rations. Medical staff treated dysentery, malnutrition, and injuries. Children were given milk powder. Pregnant women received prenatal care. For Hatsuko, the breaking point came on August 3. A Japanese woman in the camp went into labor with complications. An American military doctor performed an emergency cesarean section. He worked for 3 hours. He saved both mother and child. Hatsuko watched through the tent opening. She had seen Japanese military doctors refuse to treat wounded civilians because supplies were reserved for soldiers. That night, she asked to speak with the camp translator. What Hatsuko told the translator changed the trajectory of American psychological operations in the Pacific. She didn't just provide intelligence about troop movements or fortifications. She explained the propaganda machine. She detailed exactly what Japanese civilians and soldiers had been told about American forces. She described the suicide drills, the cyanide capsules, the lectures on how capture meant defilement and death. And she volunteered to help counter it. Within weeks, Hatsuko Mori became one of the first Japanese civilians to participate in Allied leaflet campaigns. Her testimony was recorded, translated, and printed on millions of leaflets dropped over Japanese-held islands. The message was simple: I am alive. I was not harmed. The Americans treat us with dignity. Surrender is not death. Other women followed. On Tinian, a captured nurse named Keiko Tanaka agreed to speak on radio broadcasts transmitted toward Japanese positions. Her voice, calm and clear, described her medical treatment in detail. She named the American doctors who had treated her. She listed the medications they had used. She described meals, sleeping arrangements, and the absence of violence. Japanese troops listening in the caves couldn't believe it was real. Some thought it was a recording made under duress. But Keiko's dialect was unmistakable. She was from Hiroshima, and she used phrases only someone from that region would know. The impact was measurable. On Poliliu in September 1944, Marine intelligence officers noticed a shift. For the first time, small groups of Japanese soldiers began attempting surrender rather than fighting to the death. Some carried the leaflets. Others had heard the radio broadcasts. A handful specifically asked for female translators because they believed women were less likely to execute them. The most dramatic change came on Okinawa in the spring of 1945. As the battle raged, over 300 Japanese nurses and female auxiliaries were working in the island's network of caves and tunnels. Most were students, teenagers conscripted into the Himyuri Student Corps, trained for basic medical care and thrown into the chaos of frontline casualty stations. As American forces closed in, the Japanese command ordered them to commit suicide. Some obeyed. Others hesitated. And a few remembered the stories from Saipan. They remembered the leaflets. They remembered the testimonies of women who had survived capture. On June 18, 19 members of the Himyuri Corps emerged from a cave near Mabuni. They carried white sheets torn from hospital bedding. They were starving, wounded, and terrified. American medics carried them to field hospitals on stretchers. Within hours, they were receiving blood transfusions, surgical care, and hot food. One of them, 17-year-old Yoshiko Shimabukuro, would later testify, "I thought my life ended the moment we walked out. Instead, it began again. Everything we were told was a lie." The testimonies didn't end with the war. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, thousands of Japanese women found themselves in American custody across the Pacific: nurses, factory workers, civilian refugees, and military auxiliaries. The repatriation process stretched into 1946. Ships carried them back to a homeland devastated by firebombing and atomic weapons, occupied by the very forces they had been taught to fear. What these women told their families sent shockwaves through Japanese society. In Hiroshima, Keiko Tanaka reunited with her parents in November 1945. They had believed her dead for over a year. When she described her treatment in American custody, the medical care, the respect, the safety, her father wept. Not from relief, but from shame. He had served as a junior officer in the Imperial Army. He knew how Japanese forces treated prisoners. The contrast was unbearable. Hatsuko Mori returned to Saipan's ruins as part of a civilian recovery mission in early 1946. She walked to Marpi Point and stood at the cliffs where thousands had jumped. She placed flowers at the edge. An American military photographer captured the moment. The image appeared in Japanese newspapers. Beside it, her testimony: "They died believing a lie. I lived because I chose truth." These stories reached Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. The supreme commander for the Allied powers recognized their strategic value. If Japanese women, the most vulnerable, the most propagandized, could testify to humane treatment, it undermined every justification the militarists had used for total war. It proved that American occupation didn't mean extermination. MacArthur's staff began documenting female POW experiences systematically. Interviews were conducted, recorded, and translated. The testimonies formed part of the evidence presented during the Tokyo war crimes trials. They demonstrated the difference between nations that followed international law and those that ignored it. Japanese military leaders had told their people that surrender meant death. These women proved otherwise. But the impact went deeper than propaganda. The women who returned carried with them something revolutionary: the lived experience of gender equality. They had been treated as individuals with rights, not as secondary citizens defined by their service to men. They had received medical care equal to soldiers. They had been asked their opinions. They had been listened to. In a nation where women couldn't vote until 1945, where arranged marriages were standard, where legal codes defined women as dependents of their fathers and husbands, these testimonies planted seeds of change. The American occupation of Japan, which began in August 1945, brought sweeping reforms to Japanese society. Among the most radical was the legal emancipation of women. On December 17, 1945, MacArthur's headquarters issued a directive granting women the right to vote. The following year, the new Japanese constitution enshrined gender equality in law. Women gained property rights, divorce rights, and access to education previously denied them. These weren't ideas imposed from outside alone. Japanese women themselves pushed for change, and many who did had experienced something the rest of their society had not. They had seen an alternative. The former POWs and internees became advocates, speakers, and living proof that a different social structure was possible. Yoshiko Shimabukuro, the Himyuri Corps survivor, became a nurse in post-war Okinawa. She worked alongside American medical staff during the Reconstruction. She trained in techniques she had first witnessed in the field hospital that saved her life. In 1952, she testified before the Japanese Diet about the need for universal healthcare access. Her words carried weight because she had survived what most had not. Others spoke more quietly but no less powerfully. In villages across Japan, Women who had returned from American custody told their daughters different stories than their mothers had told them. They spoke of choices. Of being treated with dignity. Of men who didn't view kindness as weakness. The cultural shift was slow, generational, but undeniable. American military psychologists studied the phenomenon extensively. Reports filed between 1946 and 1950 documented what they called cognitive restructuring through contradictory evidence. Women who had been subjected to years of dehumanizing enemy propaganda experienced profound psychological shifts when reality contradicted doctrine. The studies noted that female prisoners showed higher rates of cooperation, faster psychological recovery, and greater willingness to embrace democratic ideals than male POWs from similar backgrounds. The reason was clear: Japanese women had less invested in the imperial system. They had been subordinated by it, used by it, and told their suffering was patriotic duty. When American forces treated them as equals, they didn't experience it as enemy manipulation. They experienced it as liberation. By 1950, Japan had elected 39 women to its national legislature. Among them was a former military nurse who had been captured on Okinawa. When asked during her campaign why she entered politics, she gave a simple answer: "I learned in captivity that my voice mattered. I will not be silent again." War reveals truths that peace often obscures. On the cliffs of Saipan, in the caves of Okinawa, in medical tents across the Pacific, a simple act, offering water, cleaning a wound, speaking with respect, shattered years of propaganda more effectively than any weapon. The women who survived to tell these stories carried a message that transcended military victory. They proved that humanity persists even in the crucible of total war. That treating the enemy with dignity isn't weakness, it's strength that echoes across generations. Miyako Nakamura, the nurse who wept in that tent on Okinawa, lived to be 92 years old. She spent her final decade speaking at schools across Japan. She always ended with the same words: "I was prepared to die hating. Instead, I learned to live questioning." The greatest weapon against tyranny isn't the bomb or the bullet. It's the simple act of treating another human being as your equal. The imperial propaganda machine had taught these women to fear monsters. What they found instead were young men far from home, following orders rooted not in cruelty but in a belief, however imperfectly practiced, that all people possess inherent dignity. That belief changed the course of nations. It transformed enemies into advocates. And it proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, the choice to see each other as equals remains the most powerful force of all.